Hi, folks. Deacon Ed here, and I'm beginning a short three-part series today called Finding the Extraordinary in the Ordinary. And this is part one. Part one of this series came to me during the Easter season as I was thinking about and contemplating the different stories about the risen Jesus appearing to his disciples. I remember being in Mass one Sunday, and I was listening to the proclamation of the gospel, and it was the well-known story of the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. Jesus has been crucified, the disciples have dispersed, and these two disciples, perhaps a man and a woman, were leaving the city of Jerusalem, devastated by what has happened. And they were recounting, trying to make sense of what happened in the last 24 hours. And on the way, they meet this stranger. And this is one of many, many experiences of the risen Jesus appearing to his disciples. And what struck me was how ordinary these encounters were. It's just two people walking on the road, they meet a stranger, and then they have dinner with him. What could be more ordinary than that? Or consider when Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb, sees it's empty, and she's walking through the garden. She meets somebody who she thinks is the gardener, and it turns out to be the risen Jesus. Again, what's more ordinary than walking through a garden? Or later on when the disciples go back to Galilee, they're fishing, they're working, and the risen Jesus calls them and they have breakfast on the shore. What's more ordinary than working or having breakfast? And so in story after story, the risen Jesus appears to his disciples in these very ordinary experiences. They happen to be hiking up on a mountainside in Galilee. They're gathered together in a room and they're terrified. These are all ordinary experiences. Furthermore, these are all experiences of emotions, a range of emotions that we regularly have. And they're just ordinary emotions like fear or guilt or the experience of grieving or being lost or confused or the experience of incredible joy. The experience of reporting something and people don't believe you. The experience of walking and you're filled with doubt and you're lost and you can't make sense of life. And into these ordinary experiences and these ordinary situations and these ordinary emotions, the risen Jesus appears. And so I remember sitting there in Mass on that Sunday thinking, these experiences, these situations are so ordinary, these emotions are ordinary. You'd think that there would be kind of thunderbolts and lightning and all kinds of extraordinary experiences to indicate the risen Jesus is here. But no, they're just very ordinary and in some ways underwhelming initially. I thought, well, these are not powerful, captivating experiences. If this was a Hollywood director, he would have dressed it up with all kinds of CGI. But the New Testament tells about ordinary situations and ordinary emotional experiences. And then suddenly a light goes on in my head, and I realize that actually into these ordinary situations and emotions, something extraordinary is actually happening. And that is, the man who was definitively dead and buried is now alive and risen. This is not like Lazarus, who's been resuscitated. This is not a Jesus as a zombie. No, he's alive and risen, and therefore he's alive in a new kind of way that we've never seen before. He's freed from the forces of death. Lazarus would later die again, but Jesus now is alive in a new transformed way that makes his encounters with the disciples in the upper room and on the road to Emmaus and as the disciples are in Galilee, or whether they're in the mountain, or whether it's Mary at the tomb or Peter in the upper room or Thomas, every one of these ordinary situations becomes extraordinary because suddenly they're encountering that which no one has ever experienced before. Someone who has kind of gone through death and come out the other side, or has been experienced death and death and annihilation, and is now greater than death. And this is extraordinary. And so I want to suggest to you to begin to expand your sense of what the risen Jesus' appearance to his disciples means. But I want to take you a step further. I want you to imagine the ordinary situations in your life, whether it's getting up in the morning or going to bed, going to work, the ordinary emotional experiences you have, whether it's the stress of life, the joy of family life, the grief of losing somebody, the anxiety of job loss, or getting a difficult diagnosis, no matter what it is. I want you to realize and imagine the risen Lord coming into those situations, into those emotional experiences. What would it be like if the risen Lord, with this power that he has that is greater than death, comes into your life, into a particular relationship, into a work situation, into a set of emotional experiences you're having? I encourage you, my friends, to invite him into these experiences. You know, throughout the liturgy, the priest keeps saying, "The Lord be with you." And we keep saying, "And with your spirit." The priest is reminding us that the risen Jesus who encountered the disciples on the road to Emmaus, and the disciples in the upper room, and Mary in the garden, continues to encounter us. So ask him to come into your ordinary everyday experiences. Ask him to come into your ordinary emotional experiences, and you will suddenly discover that your life is extraordinary. See you in the next video.